Latch the windows, lock the doors, and put the kids to bed. It's time for another episode of
Tales from the Garage.
Hello, folks. I'm back. The hell is that? Oh, back again. Coming back just because it's been a longer gap than I would prefer between videos. Man, it's muggy as hell. I chose to go do my food shopping today, and I was totally unprepared for the heat that was out there. It's usually not a problem. You park and you run into the air-conditioned store, but then you come out with a ton of groceries, and you got to load up your car. And I'm going as fast as I possibly can, but it didn't work. I was soaked in sweat before the car was even loaded up and before I could drive off. I don't know. It's early September. Around here, should it really be 90 plus degrees or 90, whatever it was? I don't know. Feels hotter than that even, though. But the forecast is always, it's going to cool down, and then it doesn't. But I mean, how much longer could it hold out? I want that autumn weather to get here so I can really feel the Halloween spirit, as evidenced by things that you can't necessarily see on my back wall there. I wonder if this works. I'm going to try something here. Let's see. I'm going to try to hone in. I don't know if this is actually going to come out. I'm going to hone in on the skeletons I have hanging there, which I just discovered. There they are. They're not really in focus. I've got some plastic skeletons that I found that have been sitting right here in the garage for 5 years in a box that I just never, it was even open at the time, I just never went through it. So, and those lights are from the same box, those little orange Halloween lights are the first time I've had them plugged in since I moved here. I don't know, and I don't know, I guess I wasn't doing, I didn't think, last year. I guess last year was really when I started doing videos out here. I like to decorate for Halloween, my favorite time of year. So I'm kind of lazy, and there's a couple personal videos I want to do that really don't have anything to do with music. But they're a lot of kind of intensive thought, and there's a lot of detail, and they go on for very long. And I don't know that anybody would really be interested, save for maybe 2 people that I could think of. Not that many more than that actually watch my videos. But so instead of that, I thought I was, because it comes up, and I talk about this a lot anyway. I was watching somebody's video today, and they made mention of being a sculptor, an artist. This guy is a part-time musician, and somebody had asked him if he would have any interest in sculpting or painting, and he said, "No, not really. No, I used to draw when I was a kid, blah blah blah," which I did as well. And it got me thinking about my favorite type of album, not from a musical point of view, but from an artist point of view. And that is and I've talked about this many times before, that is the solo album, where one musician goes in and plays all the parts himself. It always fascinates me because every single note on this final product came from the composer's mind. It's completely different, especially when you're dealing with any kind of music that's not real commercial, that doesn't have a big recording budget like jazz or whatever. If you're familiar with Steely Dan, the rock band, how they used to take months and months and months and months to record an album and chop up this little piece of the saxophone player's solo and put these 3 notes to something he played a month later and all that because they had the budget to do it. That's not the way that most musicians can afford to work. So if you have a composer that's, say, a bass player or a keyboard player or whatever, and he puts together a band, say a quartet or quintet, and he's got a sax player or guitarist or trumpet player in there, and he leaves space for those guys to solo. They're going to play whatever they come off the cuff with. And even if the composer, the artist, may think, well, that's really not what I kind of heard. That's not really the kind of thing I wanted, but it's good, so I'm gonna leave it. Or maybe they have 2 or 3 takes, maybe at best, and they choose the solo that they like the best. But again, it's probably not something that they came up with in their mind. That could go one of 2 ways. This soloist could play something that the composer didn't think of. That's like, oh wow, that's really great. I never thought to do that. But I think more, that I don't think that happens the majority of the time. I think the majority of the time, it's like, yeah, the solo's fine. Or, well, the guys, they're not going to come out and say that, especially in the case, they might have brilliant musicians playing on there, and it's not the lack of musicianship, but rather the concept that the composer had for the piece and how he thought a saxophone or a trumpet solo or a guitar solo should go in the context of that piece, and it doesn't really go that way. Sounds good and everything, and I'm going to leave it kind of thing, but it's not what I would have played if I were a saxophone player kind of thing. So the thing I like about the solo album is that none of that happens. If the artist doesn't like something that he played, even if he allows himself a solo thing, he can either just very quickly redo it or leave it out. But generally, he is going to work within the parameters that his own mind has set for himself that he sees belongs in the piece. So even if all the music isn't actually written out, even if he allows himself solos, he is going to still solo and improvise within that context of the concept that he has for the piece. So that everything that comes out at the end is from this one person, from his mind, from his concept for the piece and the album and everything. And so to that end, I'm going to show some albums that I've shown before, one of which I don't know where I placed right now, but it's Terry Riley's Lifespan soundtrack, which is probably my favorite of the favorites. And that was a soundtrack done in the mid-70s, and mostly for organ, but there's also some processing on there, some like early digital delay, looping almost processing done on the Hammond organ. And Terry also does a little bit of wordless vocals, a little bit of soprano sax, a little bit of tabla drums, but it's all Terry Riley. And I've talked about how that's one of my favorite albums of all time anyway, and thankfully it's come out on CD since. I don't know where I put my vinyl. And actually, these albums I'm showing were just ones that were randomly in my pile. I wanted to show vinyl, even though I have many more favorites of the solo album, Variety, that are on CD, or even, I don't know where some of the vinyl is. I really just, to be honest, I just looked through one stack that I have on my bedroom floor. And so I didn't even grab, I didn't even see my John Abercrombie Characters, which is, one I've spoken about before. Not only is it a great solo album, but it's my favorite album by John Abercrombie, and it's the only old solo album he ever did. So it's got a lot going for it that I don't, it's not my favorite just because it's an all solo album and I have a preference toward those. It's actually, I think, the purest expression of what's so special about his music. And of course, the added bonus is that it all came from him and his fingers. So that's one of my favorites as well. There's many CDs I have that are of that variety that I don't have on an LP. And I chose LPs, and I've said it before, just because they're physically, there's more to see when you're making a video. And obviously, at some point, I'm going to have to start showing CDs again, since a much larger part of my collection is that. But here's a favorite, and here's another thing. Terje Repdal, After the Rain, from 1976, I think? Yeah, August 1976 he recorded this. Little bit of cheating on here. His wife at the time does a minor amount of wordless vocals that I could only detect on 2 tracks. and it's actually mixed so low in with the synthesizer, the keyboard string pads, is that you almost don't even realize they're there. But it's mostly, almost entirely Terji by himself, and honestly, if you mixed out the vocals, you probably would barely notice it. But there's like for instance, a very short solo flute piece without overdubbing. There's 2 acoustic guitar pieces, which are, I believe, the only time that Terji ever played acoustic guitar on record. And then there's pieces that are essentially 3 or 4 instruments going on, with Terji playing guitars and keyboards. A little bit of saxophone too on one track. Great album. Also my favorite album by him. That's not necessarily the case that just because an artist that I happen to love puts out a solo album, that it's my favorite album of their career. But in the case of John Abercrombie and Terji Repdol, and possibly the next guy, they could be. Sometimes they are. Here's another one I've spoken about probably endlessly. Ralph Towner's Blue Sun. I remember this when it came out. Like this was yesterday, recorded in December '82. It was Ralph's introduction to using synthesizers. Pretty sure this is the first time on record that he used them. I think this is before I'm pretty sure this is before he used them on Oregon's album. Because I think the first Oregon album with synthesizers came out right after this. And it's got some great pieces on here. There's only one piece that kind of breaks up the whole vibe of the album. Maybe because it's so up-tempo, I'm not sure. But so Ralph plays 12-string and classical guitars, acoustic piano, a Prophet 5 synthesizer, which was very high-tech and a very big deal at the time. He also plays French horn and cornet, which is really, I love the French horn on this. It's very minimal. And he also plays some hand percussion, which is really, I love it. It's very effective, the hand percussion that he plays. And I would have loved to have seen him recording this session, especially there's a couple tracks that are a little bit driven by the hand percussion, so he must have recorded that first. And it's just little things like tambourines and stuff like that, but very effectively done. I would have loved to have seen him recording the percussion beds for these things. He also has an earlier album that he did that was all solo called Diary, which I would have shown, but it wasn't in my stack. My stack is not, I don't know, the things that I've got scattered around here, all the artists should be together, the albums that I have by a specific artist, but they're not. They're all over the place. So he did Diary, an album called Diary. Before that, I want to say that was about 73, but I could be wrong. And Diary was also an old solo album. Very good, mostly piano and guitar. He didn't do a lot of additional instrumentation on there. That was pre-synthesizer, so there's no electric instruments on it. I don't recall him playing any horns on that album, and no percussion, so it's mostly, Diary's mostly pretty much acoustic guitar, some classical guitar, and piano. A lot of guitar and piano duets on that one. Whereas Blue Sun is just all over the place. There's probably more overdubbing than he's ever done on any of his albums, because you have in some cases, several keyboard overdubs on a specific track, as well as the percussion and the little things from the flute and the cornet. I don't know, did I show the back picture of him standing there? I love this album. I wish he would do another one like it, but I don't know. He's dead set on doing he does solo albums a lot now, but his solo albums basically are live guitar in the studio, and that's not my preference. Is not necessarily the solo album, which is a live in the studio, like a solo piano thing. I like the overdubbing. And one of the reasons that I like that, it struck me, is I call it the mad scientist factor. It's not just capturing a live performance of the guitarist going in there and playing, just playing a guitar thing live and then recording it and that's it, no overdubs, or a piano player. And there's very common, solo piano albums that are essentially live are fairly common. I like what I call the mad scientist factor, in that the artist knows he's going to go in and overdub. And maybe at the time he doesn't even know how much. So he lays down a part of the basic track with whatever instrument it is, and then decides maybe as he's going along, this needs a little bit of keyboard here, a little bit of synthesizer, a little bit of guitar, a little bit of percussion here, whatever. And they kind of add to it. The reason I like that is, it finally dawned on me after all these years, is I kind of like the image of the lone wolf scientist kind of working in his laboratory or his castle or something like that, madly putting together things. And I think of it more so than any other kind of musical situations. I tend to think of these solo albums using overdubbing as being much like painting or sculpture, where I have this image of painters and sculptors as being artists with these little studio spaces that they have, and they always work alone. They're pretty much loners, which appeals to me, I guess me being one myself. And when I think of these musicians going in and recording these albums all by themselves, and that includes guys in the Berlin School, which don't have anything like a Klaus Schulze, Time Wind, and albums like that. That idea appeals to me. I kind of see at that point the musician as being much closer to a painter or a sculptor, and I see them in the studio space and they're creating something. And especially painters, especially maybe abstract painters, not necessarily abstract, but any painter that's working kind of off the cuff, and he's creating something, and until he puts something down, he doesn't know how much else he's going to put down. He kind of is responding to what he initially put down, and okay, what goes next? What does this color suggest, or what does this instrument suggest? You know, I've got the basic chord structure that I'm going to play on a keyboard or on a guitar or something like that. But what else can I put in there? What else can I add to this landscape or to this abstract painting based on what I started to put down? And that's how I kind of see these albums. These solo albums, in my mind, tend to be more painterly than other type of group albums with, regardless of the size of the group, 3 people to 100 people, whatever, where there's more of a collaboration. I just like the image of the mad scientist, and it was probably helped along by the Terry Riley Lifespan album, because that's one of the first albums of this type that I ever purchased. And I knew nothing about Terry Riley at the time. I didn't even know he was American. I bought the album as an import, so I thought he was a European musician. And there's a picture of him in the back, and he's got his beard, and he looks like an artist. He looks like he's sitting at this Hammond with this, I think it's a Hammond anyway, with this 2 keyboards on it, 2 layers of keyboards. And it just looks like, this is a mad scientist type. And that image, I guess, stuck with me, and I guess that album was one of the things that helped it. That was one of the earliest of that type of album that I bought, along with Klaus Schulze. About the same time, maybe a little bit earlier, I'm not sure, Time Wind, and oddly enough, my first maybe like 4 Klaus Schulze purchases, totally accidentally, because I had no information on them going into them prior to buying them and opening them up, were not albums where he had anybody playing like drums on them or anything. They were all solo albums like Mirage and Time Wind, and I think Ehrlicht was one of the first. I think those were the first ones that I bought, and all of those are strictly Klaus Schulze solo. Here's another one by an artist that I love, and it's my favorite album by him. It's not the only solo album he did, all solo, but it's Bill Connors did do one other. Prior to this, guitarist Bill Connors did do a theme to The Guardian, which came before this, but I like this one much more than that one. This was recorded August 1979, and Bill Connors, all guitars, and Bill Connors may be best known as being the first electric guitarist in Chick Corea's Return to Forever, prior to Al Di Meola. But at this time, he had kind of sworn off acoustic guitars, and it was strictly playing nylon string and acoustic guitar. And there's a picture of him. I don't know if that's the actual picture of him recording it in the studio or not. But so this is all him, just multiple layers of acoustic and classical guitars, and my favorite album by him. And every time I even think of this album, it makes me want to play it, even after all these years. When did I get this? I probably close to when it was released in 1980, I'm thinking, maybe shortly afterwards. But I just don't get tired of hearing it. This is a good late night album too. And this is the first video I've done late at night now for ages, like I used to do late at night. Here's another one, and it just so happens also, I didn't realize this also happens to be my favorite album by this artist. And oddly enough, this is the first one I ever bought by him. And another ECM, Egberto Gismonti's solo album. Again, an all-acoustic affair. Not a lot of overdubbing on this, but it's got a studio sheen to it, which is just fantastic. I think only the ECM engineers could capture the subtlety and get it and make it sound so absolutely beautiful. This is subtle music, acoustic piano, acoustic guitars, 8-string guitar, and even cooking bells, which are played and they ring out, and there's a little bit of vocalization done, wordless vocals on along with them. So yeah, that's it. Piano, a couple different guitars, and cooking bells. Love this album. This is a real journey. This is a real trip. There's very long pieces on this, and for vinyl, a pretty long album. I remember. Well, I can't. This is one that I was already when this came out. When was this recorded? This was recorded in November '78. This is one that I very specifically. I must have already been into ECM, but I was very early on in my discovery of ECM, and I hadn't heard any of Egberto Gismonti's playing prior to this. I hadn't heard him as a sideman on anybody else's record. But this is one album that I specifically remember reading about in the late 70s when it came out as a new release in a magazine that I loved called Record Review. Because you have to remember, back then, no internet, so there was no information available. You didn't even know what albums were coming out until you went to the record store and you saw something that was a new release. And I remember reading about this and saying, oh, it's on the ECM label, and I don't remember much of the details of the review. I think the guy liked it, but he gave enough detail as to what the album was about, how it was an all-solo album, and 8-string guitar, and all these cooking bells and piano and all this. And I knew it was a solo album. And I'm like, oh, I'm going to pick that one up. I can remember picking it up and being really... It's a very interior album. It gets a little, I'll say, up-tempo, intense at times. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a 3 o'clock in the morning album, but there's a lot of elements in it that are, maybe it gets a little bit exciting at points where the guitar is kind of a little bit intense. But it is a nighttime. There's no doubt that it's a nighttime album. There's nothing about this that says daytime, even though the piano, one of the piano pieces gets a little up-tempo at times. Piano sounds a little bit like Keith Jarrett, as a matter of fact, on this. This is a fantastic album. Can you believe that this is, when I bought this, new, sealed, it was $5.49. I probably got that in 70, I want to say 79, I think it was. Here's another one. Now here's a guy that's recorded a lot of solo albums, and all of them with heavy overdubbing. John Sermon. This was his first for ECM that he did that kind of solo overdubbing that wasn't a group album, but he did have an earlier album called Westering Home, I believe is the title, that was done a few years prior to this for a smaller European label. I don't have that one yet, but I'm pretty sure it's up in total on YouTube, the Westering Home album, and I've heard it, just not recently. And actually, it's not an ECM. It was recorded a few years before this, so the engineering on it isn't quite up to the standards that you have with the ECM stuff. This is fantastic. I wouldn't say it's my favorite. The one thing I do is I don't have everything that John did yet on ECM. I have most of it. I'm missing a couple here and there, but I certainly have all of the solo albums. He can't put out a solo album and me not grab it. He always uses slightly different instrumentation. For those who don't know, he's a horn player. But he also, and pretty much only on his solo albums, he also plays synthesizer. And he often creates a nice little sequence for him to play the horns over on the synthesizer. And I don't know why, he pretty much never plays it in a group context, almost never. So on this one, in addition to synthesizers, he plays soprano and baritone saxophones and bass clarinets. So it's basically only 4 instruments here. On albums he did after that, and he continues to still do these solo albums. The most recent one was only a few years ago. He's added other instruments to them, so not every one of these sounds really the same. Recorders is one that he uses, for, in my mind, to great effect. There's no recorders on this album, the flute recorders I'm talking about. But when he uses them, it really works. It's really effective. It occupies a nice space in the audio zone. They're higher in pitch. So there's a slightly different flavor. It mixes a couple different instruments in there. So although there's a lot of similarities in the albums that he does that are solo, there's always something slightly different in the mix as well. And sometimes it just has to do with how many horn overdubs he plays. There's a couple tracks, I don't even recall if it's on this album or not, there's no synthesizer, but there's a ton of horns. It's like a whole horn section. It sounds like he's got to be playing at least 6 or 8 horns on a couple tracks. Heavy, heavy horn overdubs. Really great stuff. Brilliant musician. And I pulled this one and I realized, another ECM, that this isn't entirely solo because Jan Garbarek, the saxophone player, does play on 2 tracks. But this is the closest thing we do have from Mr. Gary Peacock, the bassist. And again, very unusual, bass solo albums, they're out there, but they're amongst the least common of the main instrument in a group, in a standard jazz group, I guess, solo albums. This was recorded in December 1977. I didn't get this one until probably maybe 80, maybe 1980 or so. Don't know, but I love this album. Of the 6 tracks, they're all originals, all upright bass. Again, very well recorded, which you need to be in a case like this. There is a little bit of a cheat. Jan Garbarek does play saxophone on 2 of the 6 tracks. A great album, though. Great album. Okay, so that's it for the ECMs. I only have a few more. Here's one of quite a few of Harold Budd's. I think this might be the only old solo album of his I have on vinyl, because the other, I was thinking Abandoned Cities was a solo album, but there's not. There's guitar deep down in the mix of that one. So here's one that is all solo, and it's called Lovely Thunder, which I bought shortly after it came out. I think this was recorded in 86. Yeah, it doesn't say. It came out in 86. I bought it, I was already a convert at that point to Harold Budd from his earlier albums, which weren't all solo. Was thrilled to see him do a solo album. Shortly after I got this, I saw the compact disc, because this was, again, I pretty much switched over to compact discs in 85 when they came along, but they weren't always available. So I bought this in 86 on vinyl. Shortly after, I remember seeing in the store the compact disc, wishing I had picked that up. And I did have to pick it up because it had one additional track on it that wasn't on the vinyl album, and a really good piece too. It was only about an extra 5 minutes, but I just had to go for it. So maybe I should have waited a little bit longer. This is definitely one of my favorite. I have trouble picking a favorite because there's some pieces on this album and on others that are so individual pieces that are so good. But this is definitely ranks up there with my favorites. And again, Harold Budd, just all synthesizers, all keyboards, a little bit of the electric piano that he a very dark sound that he uses on electric piano, and that's evident on pretty much one track here, which is primarily electric piano, very dark. The rest of the album is pretty much synthesizers. I love the settings he uses, and the funny thing is, he said he doesn't go out of his way to program synthesizers and create new sounds. He just finds patches that he likes, and he always does it too. To me, the patches that he uses are as good, if not better, than some of these other musicians that spend months creating patches, and I think they get caught up with the fact that, oh, I created a patch of sound that I haven't heard anybody else use, but the sound isn't really that good. Or there's many other patches that pre-exists that are much better than this patch that you created. So I think a lot of musicians, a lot of electronic musicians get hung up on that and don't use patches that are kind of out of the factory box. Nothing wrong with that. Here's another one. And I just realized looking at the back of this that here's a guy that was from New Jersey. Anthony Davis, Middle Passage, an album that I've shown before. This is one of those that I missed when it came out on CD, and it's damn hard to get now, and I really want to get the CD of it. Mostly piano, mostly solo piano, but there's also some pre-recorded tapes. This is kind of, there's 4 pieces on the album, 2 of them very long, and they're all kind of compositions with concepts behind them. And I think probably most of it is essentially live piano, but there are pieces on here, at least one longer piece that has a pre-recorded electronic tape that is used that the pianist plays along with. Really good album. Really, how do you describe it? It's hard. It's kind of experimental. It's not incredibly free avant-garde, but it's not jazz. It's certainly not somebody playing jazz standards. Really good creative album if you have open ears. And just a couple more. I think I've shown this and spoken about this. Is Bar Phillips' first solo album. Another bass solo album, Journal Violin, which is actually Journal Violin number 1. Recorded in, I think, 68. I remember getting this on the Opus label, Opus number 2. Remember getting this mail order. I had already discovered Bar Phillips through ECM and had Journal Violin 2. And, again, pre-internet got, this is probably late 70s, early 80s. It's probably early 80s. Got a hold of a record catalog that had this as a mail order item, and I mail ordered it. And I only learned recently that these Opus 1 album covers, see the coloring's a little weird. Apparently if you put them under a black light, you see things that you don't see when you're looking at it like this, and I guess also the images look more three-dimensional. But the stuff in the background, apparently under the black light, certain things are highlighted, and you see on these Opus 1 albums that came out at the time, you see things that you can't see with the plain eye just looking at it in normal daylight. And I just learned about literally a couple months ago. I don't have a black light, but I'll try it one of these days. Here was one that was a gift from a good buddy. Kind of in a different genre, I guess, in a different area. And somebody that kind of slipped my memory until I was flipping through the records. I'm like, oh yeah, he did do a lot of purely solo albums, and actually the late Tomita, who passed away recently. This is now called Bolero, but was titled different titles in Europe though. But in America, the release title was Bolero, where he does generally electronic versions of classical pieces. But if you really listen to them, it's not as you would if somebody just said, well, this guy recreates classical music written for orchestras, but he does it on synthesizers. You tend to think that somebody's sitting there recreating all the parts from an orchestra, whereas most of the time on the Tomita stuff, like Snowflakes Are Dancing, which is another all-solo album, which is fantastic. It's the first thing I ever bought by Tomita, and it's a brilliant album. And that's all pieces by Debussy, but they're not note-for-note recreations. Rather, it's more like he takes segments of the original composition, and you can hear these segments in the pieces themselves, but they're only little segments, a little melody and phrases here and there, and he creates this other electronic world for them to exist in. So it's more like quoting the originals rather than sitting down with like a manuscript and reading the way classical musicians would and playing each individual part, but just on synthesizer. And I like his concept, though you often wouldn't get a very good feel for what the originals sound like necessarily from his interpretations. But I've forgotten that a lot of and probably most of the classic Tomita albums, which would have been things from the 70s, are pretty much solo albums, I guess. I love this guy's stuff. It was very sad when he passed away. So here's another one, and this is definitely one of my top 3 of the Tomita albums, along with one called Snowflakes Are Dancing. And that's it. I didn't mean to go on for so long. Fingers crossed that this video doesn't get erased when I hit stop record. And maybe I will come back and talk about personal things and non-musical things, but I will warn you so you don't have to sit through them at the beginning of the video if I'm going to do that. Okay, guys? Hope everybody's well on this late night. And I will be back soon. Take care.
Tune in next time for more
Tales from the Garage.